All right, so today I would like to talk about job outsourcing and international trade wars. This is the most difficult lecture of definitely this course, and possibly the most difficult lecture of all the courses these days. Unless you've been living under a rock, you probably know how contentious, how confrontational the issue of international trade has become, not only in the United States, but everywhere. Europe, obviously, international trade, job outsourcing, immigration for that matter, have become the hottest topic and essentially the reason for much of the political developments in the European Union of the past several years. In the United States, obviously, this is all we've been talking about for many years now, ever since the crisis started in 2008, but especially in the last few years when Trump has effectively started trade wars with China, with the NAFTA neighbors, Mexico, Canada. And unfortunately, this is one of those topics where people think here and not here. So it's a very emotional, very personal issue. It's an issue that also is affected by our political loyalties and tribalism. So it's an issue where people talk about not so much using the numbers, but kind of defending and supporting their own tribe or political tribe. And so in many cases, reason has taken the backseat, and emotions, political loyalties, ideologies have been governing the way we think about it. And so this makes it extremely difficult to talk about this, an extremely difficult issue, because you say something different from what the person believes or tries to prove, and you can literally offend someone. You can invoke such an aggressive or strong emotional response that the mind just shuts down and the person is completely focused on trying to prove his or her original point of view. It's a very known psychological phenomenon. If you would like to learn more about it, by the way, I highly recommend the book called The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Disagree on Politics, Religion, and Ethics, I believe. And so the book is written by a neuropsychologist who talks about how our brains deal with issues that confront our worldviews. So it's not because somebody is right and wrong or good or bad, it's just because that's how we evolved to be. That's how our brains work. And so at the risk of making some people unhappy, I would like to deliver this lecture because I believe that job outsourcing and trade wars are probably the most important topic of international business today. And I want to give you some foundation, some structure to think about these issues. I will deliberately present both sort of sides of the view. So when we will be talking about, for example, some of the Trump's or Obama's policies, I will do my very best to show you when and how or which of the aspects of those actions and policies are positive and which are negative, when they work and when they don't. Because it's not black and white in a sense that it's not always good or bad. So each time there is a cost and there is a potential benefit. So I'll try to give you the full picture so that you can make up your own mind. But as I said, by kind of showing both sides of the story, I risk to offend both camps. Again, those in the United States, we have two political camps, and they lately especially, I noticed, don't like each other. And in most cases, they define right and wrong by whether or not that's what their camp proposes and the other camp opposes. And so by kind of showing how both camps sometimes are right and sometimes are wrong, I risk that both camps will hear only the parts that I say they are wrong about, and so both camps will be unhappy. So I truly hope you will keep your minds open, and instead of picking the things that I will maybe criticize about your ideology or your camp's ideology, try to also hear what I criticize or point out or praise about the other camp, because as I said, just about any action, any policy, any development has positives and negatives. And so I would like to start this lecture. Let me share the screen here. I would like to start this lecture with an exercise that I do with my students when I offer this lecture in the classroom. This exercise is specifically designed to open up your minds. And let's see if it's going to work, but try to answer these questions honestly, because I promise you will find it refreshing. When I saw these questions and when I tried to answer them, well, let's see how it goes, but to me it was a big revelation. So many people, Republicans, Democrats, Europeans, Americans, Chinese, worry about imports, job outsourcing. Many people worry that foreign-made products kill jobs in our own country. Americans believe that what's made in China and sold in the United States kills American jobs. So do think Europeans. Chinese now see more and more imports and worry about the same thing. So imports from poorer countries than China. So obviously people have issue with imports. The question is, should we then ban imports altogether, in your opinion? Or if some imported goods should be allowed, the question is how much is good? How much is okay? And so I would like to ask you a few questions, and let's see, I strongly recommend that you record your answers. I will give you sort of the correct statistics later on, and as well as will tell you what other students, as well as people who have taken the survey normally answer. And so here's the question. And by the way, I've done it with at least a few thousand people, so I have a good benchmark of what normally people say. So first, imagine that you are omnipotent, that you have any, all powers in the world, and you can change the economy the way you want. And so imagine that I ask you, what fraction of the US consumer spending should go for goods labeled made in the United States? So we buy some local goods and services and some foreign goods and services, right? So if every dollar that you spend, you have a dollar here. So for every dollar that you spend, let's do $100. So for every $100 that you spend, right, what percentage, what fraction should go towards American-made goods, and then what percentage should go towards foreign-made goods? So you have 100% or $100. What percentage should be for American-made goods, and what percentage should go for foreign-made goods, right? So write that down. I'll give you the answers in a minute. Now, since lately we had an issue with China specifically, the question I have now, all right, so let's say you said, I don't know, 50% should go for American goods, 50% should go for foreign-made goods, or 80-20, or 70-30, whatever you chose. Of the percentage or dollars that go towards foreign-made goods, what percentage do you think in the perfect world should be spent on Chinese-made goods? I mean, again, if you believe that Chinese goods should be banned altogether, like not a single Chinese product should be here, like this microphone made in China, this keyboard made in China, I'm not sure, I will not be surprised if this t-shirt is made in China, this computer, this cup probably is made in China. In fact, indeed, yes, it is. Oops, I have water in it. This one's probably too made in China. So if you think none of this should be made in China right here. So if you think none of this should be sold in the United States, then say $0 should go towards made in China. If you think that it's okay to buy some Chinese goods, say 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, 20, 50, 80, whatever you think. So write down that number, all right? So now you have, in the ideal world, if you were God, if you could regulate the US economy with a flip of your fingers, you would spend of this $100, certain portion on American-made goods, certain portion on foreign-made goods, and of the foreign-made goods, certain portion on Chinese-made goods. So record your answers. Now, let me see if you know the real answers, and again, I'll give those answers to you. So you have your perfect scenario, and now let's see what would be the real scenario. So how much do you think an average American, you make some money and you spend some money on all kinds of things, whatever you buy, services, goods, anything that you buy. Let's say you make $100 or $1,000 or $1,000,000. So on average, Americans, how much do they spend on American goods, on foreign goods, and on Chinese goods? Write down those numbers. Got him? Again, I strongly encourage you to think about it. Now, I'll give you the answers. And here is the thing. So Americans spend, from every $100 that Americans spend, the statistic shows, and I have the articles in the optional readings, so you can read them, that $88.5 of every 100 is spent on American-made products, or $11.5% are spent on foreign-made products. Of those, only $7.3 are actually going overseas. So even though we spend basically $10 or $11 out of every 100 for a foreign-made good, like for example, this charger probably made in China, and let's say I spend $10 on it. The thing is that of that $10, only a portion actually goes to China, because part of it is spent on American companies, logistics, advertisement, retail. So much of that actually stays in the United States because it was an American store that had to charge to sell it, to deliver it, to market it, to advertise it. So of $100 that we spend on everything, goods and services, only about 7% goes to foreign countries, right? Now, when we look at China, same thing. Of those, only 2.7% are spent on Chinese goods. And again, if you subtract the cost incurred within the United States on transportation, advertisement, retailing, only 1.9% goes to China. So of every $100 that we spend in the United States, 2%, less than 1.9% goes to China. Now, what's scary about this is that I don't know what you personally wrote, but as I said, I've done this exercise many times. And on average, most Americans believe that we spend over half of everything that we spend on Chinese-made goods and foreign goods. And they believe that the optimal level would have been maybe like 30%. And so here's the problem. One, they have no clue what's going on. Two, if they had powers to do and change the way they want the economy structure, they would have actually been sending to China 10, 20, 30 times more than we are sending today. And so I'm not saying that one level is right and the other level is wrong. What I'm saying is that in most cases, people passionately advocate certain practices, certain policies, and yet they have no clue what's really going on. So they're fighting very passionately for some resolutions, while they have absolutely no touch with reality and know what's going on. And by the way, yes, the numbers are correct. You can verify them, just Google. And as I said, I have an article, because most of the money Americans spend would be on housing, which is all American, on transportation, which again includes both like tickets and buses, but also cars. And basically our cars are primarily spent in the United States. Education in the United States, food, most of it, in fact, is American-made. America is a major agricultural country. So we only buy overseas electronics, clothing, maybe some cheap toys and things like that, maybe some food. And so every month I spend, I don't know how many $1,000s on my life, but most of that would be housing, transportation. I mean, like I may buy a t-shirt once a month or maybe pants, but that's a small percentage of my expending. I mean, maybe a computer once every couple of years, maybe a TV, but I mean, each time it just, let's say a few hundred to a couple, to $1,000. So percentage-wise, it's actually not that much. And most of the money stays in the United States. In fact, not most, a huge portion. So people have no idea that. And so the reasonable question then becomes, well, is job outsourcing really bad? If it is bad, who wins and who loses? And what can be done about it? And again, before we get into the details, I would like to again stress that there are two opposing views here. And I'll use China. Again, I apologize if I have Chinese students, kind of apologize that I'm picking on you. But I mean, that's the top story these days, China versus the United States in international trade. And it would be, not right to hide that fact. I mean, I could talk about a hypothetical country, or I could talk about some, Malaysia or Japan. But the point is that it is now boiled down to the US-China disputes, and it would make sense to look at the issue directly and call it what it is, rather than try to hide behind some politically correct statements. So yes, we will be talking about China and the United States. And when people hear job outsourcing, they in most cases think about outsourcing to China. And so I guess it would do everyone a service if we talk about it as it is. And so when we talk about job outsourcing, so there are two opposing views. So one camp thinks that job outsourcing is bad, right? They believe that jobs or goods made overseas are bad for the US economy or whatever other country, because made in China or made in Ukraine or made in Japan is not made in the United States. So a job that could have been here is there. So it's our loss and their gain. Other people believe, no, it's actually good, because job outsourcing means that, probably the company did some mathematics, did some economic analysis, determined that it would be cheaper to make the product overseas, made it overseas, and as a result, the cost of production was cheaper, and so as a result, the consumers can get the product cheaper. And so if I don't have to spend that much on the product, I have some money left in my pocket, in my wallet, that I can spend on other goods and services, and thereby create demand and jobs in the United States. And so just to illustrate how those things work, I'll show you two short videos. And again, let's see if it's going to work well, because I will be sharing the screen, but I will also post those original videos in video. So let's see if it's going to work, but if not, you can just watch it as a separate one. So this first video is a ad from a few years ago from a campaign. You have a link here, posted against Dick DeVos, which incidentally actually is the husband of the current Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. But this one was aired a long time ago, even before Betsy, so it's like from 2006. So long before, apparently even before Obama. So that's the Bush's era. And so this is, again, don't worry about the specific names and specific people here. The point here is that this is how people often hear about job outsourcing. So usually that's the topic of the political debate during elections. And in most cases, people are presented with these messages in a very charged, emotionally charged political context. So here is the message about job outsourcing, which happened to be an anti-ad against Dick DeVos.
The truth about Dick DeVos in China? September 6th, finally, Dick DeVos admitted he cut Michigan jobs and created jobs in China. Fact, as president of Amway, he laid off nearly 1,400 Michigan workers. Fact, he invested $200 million in China. Fact, he built a factory there and created thousands of jobs for China. Is that what Michigan needs? Dick DeVos, the more you know, the worse it gets.
So as you can see, the message, the way it's presented is very negative, in black tones, and, obviously designed to invoke a strong negative emotional response. And people are bombarded with messages like this. I mean, this is just one of thousands of examples. People are bombarded with messages like this on social media, on TV, on radio, and in many cases, they just get terrified every time they hear job outsourcing or China. So here is the opposite view. Again, right or wrong, not to judge, just to show you. Again, let's see if it's going to work.
Hello? You gotta be kidding me. I'm buying a freaking American Eagle from a company that's supposed to be in America, and I get it in the end.
I understand that you're upset, sir.
No, you don't. You don't understand. Last month, I lost my job at the plant where I worked for 22 years because the whole operation was in Mexico. My brother had to leave town because of no job.
I know how you feel, sir.
No, you don't. You have a job.
Sir, please don't hang up. I have a solution for you.
What?
See, we understand that many Americans are upset about outsourcing, so we have located American-made versions of all our products. If you have a pen, I will give you the website of an American company that makes an eagle statue very similar to ours. Same size, same materials, only theirs is made 100% in America.
Well, thanks. I appreciate it, but is the price about the same?
No, sir. Theirs is $212 more. Sir?
Yeah, all right. Just let me hear.
Thank you, sir. May I have your credit card number?
So again, this one obviously is, again, kind of propaganda designed to think you in the opposite direction. So job outsourcing is wonderful. It lowers prices. And so people are angry and not happy about job outsourcing until it touches their pocket. Once they have to pay more for American-made goods, they all of a sudden change their opinion and say, okay, sell me the cheaper one from China, for example. Again, right or wrong, not important in this case. The point is that we have these two perfectly opposing views. And so the question is, what is the truth? And some people would say that the truth is somewhere in between, but no, the truth is that both of those are true. So yes, it has positives and negatives, and it's important to recognize both. And so that's what we'll do today. But before we do, let me again play one more game with you. So this is the game that I sometimes play with my students in the classroom. And again, I even want to write a paper because I already have enough data about it. It's one of those very fascinating topics where well, let me play it and you'll understand what I mean. So most Americans, and Europeans for that matter, have a problem with outsourcing jobs to low labor countries. Like, for example, China, or like, for example, I don't know, Philippines and Mexico for that matter. And so they don't seem to complain about job outsourcing to, let's say, Germany or Japan. Nobody seems to be complaining about German-made BMWs or Mercedes cars coming into the United States, or Japanese Lexus cars. Again, many of them are made actually in the United States, but some are imported. And so nobody seems to compete or to complain about that. So we are not happy about job outsourcing to countries where labor is cheaper. Now, to illustrate how that works, I play this game with my students. Imagine this. So you probably recognize the guy on the picture, Tony Robbins. And so if you've seen the movie called Shallow Hal, there is a scene at the beginning of the movie where Hal is stuck in the elevator with Tony Robbins, and Tony does some hypnosis, and Shell starts seeing only the inner beauty of women. Well, imagine in this case that Tony has those powers, and he can affect how people think. And so he looks at the United States and believes the rhetoric that America is hurting because too many, Americans could be wealthier and could benefit from being wealthier. And he doesn't know what to do. So what he decides to do is he decides to go to China and to come to the Foxconn factory, which is the biggest factory in the world. And that's incidentally the factory where the Apple computers, Apple company makes all kinds of, devices, iPhones, computers, and so on. And so Tony couldn't think of anything better than to hypnotize the workers of Foxconn factory, all 1.2 million of them, into loving America so much that they would be sending those Apple products to the United States for free. So he goes there, he does his hypnosis, and the workers say, oh, you know what, let's help America. How can we help America? We'll send them computers and cell phones for free. And so the question is it good for America? Is it good for America if China started sending, loves America so much that they started sending those products to the United States for free? Like, if you have an iPhone, do you have an iPhone? If you have an iPhone, instead of paying $1,000 for your iPhone X, Foxconn factory workers send it to you for free. So the question is it good for you? Is it good for America? Or if you have, like myself, a Samsung phone, Koreans decided, the hypnosis was so strong that it affected even the neighbor in Korea. And so instead of paying $1,000 for this Note 9, they sent it to me for free. So the question is it good or bad? Think about it for a second. If you are like my students, you probably think it's good. There is always one smarty pants who says, oh, it's bad because it will make us lazy. But no, most people say it's good. And they recognize that if I got my phone for free and I didn't have to spend $1,000 on it, I would spend $1,000 on something else, right? I could spend $1,000 on buying something else, getting a new haircut, or buying a new, maybe repairing my car, or maybe painting my house or doing something like that. Now I had to spend the money on the phone. So as a result, that diminished my capacity to create demand for American-made goods. So that's good. Most people would say, yeah, that's wonderful. But then time goes by, and that hypnosis sort of, fades out, so wears out. And so now those Chinese workers say, you know what, we're not going to send this product to you anymore for free. Now we're going to charge 1 cent for every phone that we send to you. So the question is, if you have to pay 1 cent, is it still good for America? Is it still good for you? If you are like most of my students would say, yeah, it's still good. Yeah, sure. An iPhone or Galaxy Note or whatever you buy from China for 1 cent, not bad. Well, a few more weeks pass by and they say, now we want to charge 10 cents per unit per phone. And then a few weeks later, well, $1. Is it still good? How about $100? How about, let's see how much money I have. I probably don't have much. How about $500? Is that how much I have? Yeah, I didn't realize we have so much. Well, anyway, how about $500 for the phone? Is that still good for America? When I reach this amount of money, most of my students say, yeah, 500 is still okay. It's still good. But then how about $1,000? And I wish I had enough cash with me, but no, I don't. But anyway, how about $1,000? So that hypnosis, kind of completely fades out. And so now they want to charge what the product costs on average, in the store. So is this still good for America? And then, as it often happens with, psychological, effects, they reverse their thinking and they say, now, from now on, we're going to charge $2,000 for this phone. Is it still good for America? And so my students usually say, yeah, it's very good when it's free. I can see how it will save me money. I will use that saving to buy other products and pass on that demand and jobs to other American jobs. 1 cent, 10 cents, $1, $100, $500, sure. But when it gets closer to the actual market price, they say, yeah, I'm not sure about that. And when I say $2,000, $3,000 for a phone or computer, they say, no, that's already too bad. Yeah, that's not good for America. And so what bothers me here is that it seems like we are against outsourcing or imports from countries where labor is cheap, because those products are cheaper than what it would cost us to make it here locally. And so we are concerned about that because their cheaper labor and cheaper products will kill jobs here. And so when we talk about it in the context of job outsourcing and international trade, we think here, we think emotionally, we remember those ads, and we get scared and we say, we don't want any imports from China. But when we remove all that emotional stuff away and just talk about numbers, just talk about dollars, and just talk about products, all of a sudden people completely reverse their thinking. And all of a sudden they are defending the policies that would give them free products or nearly free products. And they are against the policies where the products from other countries would cost a lot of money. So think about that. So when we are thinking about it emotionally, we advocate one policy, and in many cases ferociously. I mean, people literally sometimes, very passionately advocate against imports. But when we remove the emotions from the equation and look at the mathematics and economy, people completely change their view. So it's not a change like of 10%. We are talking that 95% were against it in one scenario, and now all of a sudden the same 95% are for it in the opposite scenario, even though mathematically nothing has changed. So this is what scares me most. So it's not that one policy is right and one policy is wrong. It's just people defend those policies, often without thinking about them in mathematical terms, in economic terms. So very, very scary. Here is another example, and this is a real story. I have a link here. You can click on that in the slide. About protecting jobs at all expense. So a real story happened in 2013, 2012. So there was this guy in San Diego or San Jose, Silicon Valley, who submits his tax returns, and whoever gets audited, and whoever audits his tax returns notices that the guy claims that he has a total of like 5 full-time jobs or something like that, or 7 full-time jobs. And so he claims that he has 7 full-time jobs and makes $100,000 in each of those, or $120,000, something like that. So in any case, he filed tax returns for $750,000 per year, where he was working in those multiple jobs. And so it makes no sense. How can somebody have multiple full-time jobs at different companies? So investigation starts, and here's what they find. A programmer at that time in the Silicon Valley was making on average about $100,000 per year. A programmer who does the same job, writes the same code in India, was making at that time about $15,000 a year. This guy applied for multiple jobs at multiple companies in the Silicon Valley. Many of them allow flexible office arrangements, so you can work from home, you can be in the office whenever you feel like that. So he got seven full-time jobs, and instead of doing them himself, he outsourced his jobs to India. And he was diligently paying his Indian guys to whom he outsourced the job $15,000 or $10,000 a year. He was diligently collecting his paychecks from the employers here in the United States, 8 or 7 of them. And then in the end was basically making close to $1 million. Now, some companies were not happy with that. They felt it was cheating, and so he got fired. But then the question is, who's right and who's wrong here? The irony here is that technically, if you believe that job outsourcing is bad, then the dude actually did save 7 American jobs. I mean, you had 7 income-generating, good jobs in the United States. He was doing those jobs. He was paid for them. So, but at the same time, he sort of outsourced them to India. And so I don't know, is he a hero who saved 7 jobs in the United States because companies could have outsourced them directly to India? Or is he a cheater who actually did the outsourcing? And so if that's what it takes, I mean, if there is really someone in China who can do your job for 15% of the cost it would cost to do the job here in the United States, is it really better for the United States to keep the job here? Or is it really better to outsource it? I mean, who wins, who loses? I mean, obviously the consumers would be losing because, you know, if the company that produces the service or product has to pay much more for labor, I guess the price will be higher. So the consumers will lose. But will the company lose or gain? So, well, if the company outsources the job, they can save money on the labor cost. Maybe they gain. But then again, is it better to have a job in the United States, pay more to the workers, and then have a more expensive product? Or is it better to outsource it and have a cheaper product? So all in balance. But think about this issue here, the programmer from San Jose. As I said, it's not so simple, not so simple. If you really want to keep the jobs in the United States, this is what it might take it. So how do you say it? This is what it takes to keep them here. And so yeah, that's a difficult issue. So another piece of statistics, and by the way, I should probably get a real graph. I mean, I keep using this mock-up graph, but you can easily find the data online. Many people believe that import skilled jobs, and again, it's very important to understand that there is a zero correlation between the two. Over the last century or so, imports into the United States, both in terms of the absolute dollars, but also as a percent of GDP, have been steadily increasing, right? So you can look at the imports, you know, there was much less trade in the past. Again, as I said, as a percentage of GDP as well as total dollars. And it's been a pretty steady trajectory. So it's been growing steadily. Unemployment at the same time over these 100 years or so has been fluctuating between like 3 and 6% and 7%, 10% during the crisis. So there was absolutely no relationship with imports and between imports and unemployment, because if there was, imports have been increasing steadily and pretty fast. So if you believe that one should affect the other, then we would see the same increase in unemployment, and that hasn't happened. In fact, the only time when the two were moving together, it was during the crisis, like for example in 2008, when the economy tanked. Unemployment went up all the way up to 11% in some states, in fact in 2009, 2010. But that incidentally was also the time when imports went down. So that was the time when America was actually buying less from China. And so people who believe that import skilled jobs, well, if imports went down, then jobs should have been on the rise, but actually we saw the unemployment on the rise. So there is really no correlation, at least not, when you look at the two trends here. So they may have some effect on one another, but there is definitely no direct relationship. Now, anyway, here is a graph. I mean, here is a question that may appear on the exam, just to give you an idea how we talk about it. And just as I discussed now, you can pause and read the question more carefully. But just like we discussed now, no, if you look at the trends over time in unemployment and in imports, there is really no correlation. One is relatively steady, fluctuating between a couple of percent, the other one always growing. And if anything, the relationship is negative. So when imports go down, unemployment goes up, and the other way around. At least that's what happens during the crisis. Again, affected by a third factor. Another thing that is very important to think about when we talk about international trade and import tariffs and job outsourcing is, what is America? What is America? What constitutes America? Many people, when we talk about job outsourcing, for some reason, they always only think about factory workers. They always think about this guy on the assembly line who had a job and now doesn't have a job. But it is very important to understand that America is more than that. Most Americans, in fact, are not factory workers, and in fact never were. So there was agriculture here, there was all kinds of different businesses. And so when you look at different groups of Americans, you will see that outsourcing affects them differently. Factory workers may be affected negatively. Factory owners, entrepreneurs, may be affected very positively. If they outsource production to Mexico or China, where labor is cheaper, they reduce production costs and increase profits. It could be also people who work in logistics who seem to benefit from outsourcing. Could be maybe people who work in retail or in marketing. Cheaper products from overseas are sold more, so there is more need for retail, there is more need for marketing. So which of those American groups or groups of Americans most important? Well, I don't know. I would say they are all important. And if one loses, another wins, I guess, I don't know. It's hard to say if it's good or bad for America. You need to literally look at the number of people in each category. What I'm saying here is that it's very dangerous to worry about one group at the expense of other groups. It's very dangerous to try to protect one group, even if all the other groups lose. Like, for example, it's very dangerous to think about and try to protect only workers of a particular industry, factory workers in a particular industry, when you know that the attempts to protect them means that every single individual who buys that product will have to pay more. So who is more important? The manufacturers or the people at the assembly line, or people, consumers in the store? So not so easy, but it's very important to keep in mind, as I said, that America is more diverse than just factory workers. And so when you look at companies that are iconic American brands like Apple, Nike, HP, General Motors, Chrysler, those are big outsourcers. In fact, Nike never made shoes in the United States, but it makes millions, billions of dollars for the American economy. Apple, I mean, we love to love Apple. Steve Jobs, everybody admires him. But the truth is that Apple makes its computers in China. And so, in fact, has for a long time. And so there is a video that I would like to show you. I'll add it in the additional videos, but it's an interview with first Steve Jobs, but then a few years later, Steve Jobs died, with Tim Cook. And the reporter is asking Tim Cook about job outsourcing to China. Why are you making products in China? And he says, honestly, he says, well, it's not so much about, labor, cheap labor. He says Chinese labor is no longer cheap. In fact, it's quite expensive. In fact, it's very expensive compared to what it used to be, and it's not much more cheaper than what American labor costs. So he says that outsourcing to China today is primarily for capabilities. The truth is that China has developed very strong capabilities of production. And, when you have to manufacture on a very large scale like Apple does, it's simply impossible logistically, technologically to do it in the United States. And so they literally have to do it in China because America does not have that capability. Should it develop that capability? Possibly. But the point here is that Apple cannot make a comparable product at a comparable price in the United States anymore, and not even because it's cheaper labor in China. It's a whole different set of reasons. And so if you want your iPhone for what it costs today of the same quality Apple has no choice but to make them in China. So it's a much, much more complicated issue. Just like, for example, Japan still and Germany probably make the best cars. Again, do we want to compete with them? Yes, we do. Do we want to produce them here? Yes, we do. But then again, sometimes companies literally have to go overseas to make some products because for that quality, for that price, that's the only way to do it. So very important to do it. And then after all, what kind of economy do you want to have? Like imagine that all American economy became like Apple and Nike. So where the design and ideas and marketing and promotion and intellectual component of the product is created in the United States, and the dirty, cheap, polluting production happens, for example, in China. Wouldn't it be better if all of the companies were like Apple and like Nike? I don't know. I do believe that some production capabilities must always reside and retained in the country. So I kind of like that. But at the same time, I don't know. I'm not sure if it's better for the United States to have sweatshops that crank out, goods for minimum pay on the assembly line, where the person has to repeat the job over and over again, as opposed to where the company is more like Nike, like Apple, like HP, where here it's doing the design and the actual production happens overseas. I don't know. It seems to me that it would have not been the worst thing. So just keep that in mind. Now, let's get into some more contentious stuff. So looking, for example, at companies that generate the most money per employee. Again, Apple, for example, has a large labor force, about 40,000 employees in the United States, right? And it's the same, by the way, for many other intellectual profit companies. So it used to be that the highest profit per employee was generated by employees, first of oil companies. Then for a long time, it was the banking industry, Wall Street. And then lately, it's by far the technology companies like Apple, like Google, like Facebook. And in fact, today, Apple employees generate about $500,000 per employee per year for the company. I should have included the statistics, but it seems like now Google and Microsoft generate even slightly more than that. So that's a huge, huge revenue or value added per employee. And so Apple doesn't have employees, or has some, but not many in China. And so it outsources the production. And the production employees actually generate much, much less per employee for the company. So they're paid relatively low wages. They stay on the assembly line. And so here in the United States, a job like that would probably pay, I don't know, $10, $15 plus or minus. It's a very simple, repetitive job, right? And in China, they probably pay about half of that. So, but in the total cost of a product, it's still a very small portion, relatively small portion of the total price. And so the question then also is, what kind of jobs do you want to have here? So you have to recognize, as I said, that Apple is also America. And if Apple can make those products cheaper in China, and because of that be more successful and sell more of its products globally, because Apple, Microsoft, Google, they sell their products globally. If that outsourcing allows them to be more successful and sell more products globally, including in the United States, and keep the prices cheaper for you, the consumers, how is that bad for the economy? How is that bad for the United States? How is that bad that an employee of one of those companies generates $500,000 or more per company per year? So why is that bad? And would it really be better if they also had the jobs here in the United States that are basically sweatshop jobs? I don't know. Maybe they would be. There are many people who would like to work and cannot find the job. But again, just look at it a little bit bigger than that. Now, many people then would say, well, if this is, if outsourcing is not so bad, how come we hear so many complaints about job outsourcing and so little praise about it? And it is true that we often see protests against NAFTA, against products from China, but never do we see the opposite. Well, there are several psychological reasons. People get very vocal when they lose something and not necessarily so much when they gain something. If I had a job in a factory and I lost it, it's a huge loss for me. And yes, it may be a small portion of the people who lost it, but for them, it's a big deal. It's a very, very big deal. And obviously, I would go on the streets if that happened to me. At the same time, if I gain something. I mean, I wouldn't be on the street. Like, for example, it's very likely to see a guy on the street who says NAFTA kills jobs. Very likely. But for example, a Chevy Silverado truck that is made in Mexico costs about $5,000 less because it's made in Mexico. So if it had to be made in the United States, it would be about $5,000 more. So millions of consumers buy those kinds of products, cars, for example, from Mexico, and save up to $5,000, maybe even more in some models of trucks. And it's a very important positive economic effect. So the guy who saved $5,000 on a Chevy Silverado now has extra $5,000 to buy something else. But it's extremely likely to see a guy protesting against NAFTA than a guy with a sign saying, I'm so happy because I saved $5,000 in my Mexican-made truck. In fact, in some parts of the country, this guy with a sign that I saved $5,000 in a Mexican-made truck, he literally can be beaten up. And so here, that's one of the reasons why we hear about one side, but not the other. Whereas both of them are extremely important, have a very strong effect on economy, just one positive, one negative. So the way it's stacked is that we hear a lot about the negatives, but very little about the positives. So does it mean that job outsourcing is always good or imports are always good? No, it doesn't. So as I said, often it's simply bad for specific regions, and it's a devastation. So if you know what happened, for example, in the Rust Belt in the 90s to the car industry, to other businesses there, it was devastating. So when jobs started leaving to other countries, and in those parts of the country, it was literally leaving. Like a factory literally would be packed, and the equipment would be sent to, for example, Mexico, and Mexican workers would be hired there and do the job. So for that region, like Flint, Michigan, for example, Detroit, that was a huge loss. And so for them, it was a big, big problem. And so when those changes happen very quickly and people have no time to retrain and find other jobs, you can literally have ghost towns where nobody has a job, where everybody is on welfare. So it's a big deal. Like when that factory employed 80% of the town's population, when they leave, that's a devastation. So obviously it's a problem. And so sometimes it may be wise to do something to prevent that quick change, just because the transition period may be devastating for the local economy. Sometimes also it makes sense to provide some sort of protectionism or some sort of restrictions on imports when you're trying to support infant industries, as we call it. So let's say you don't have a capability to make a specific product. For example, let's say you believe in green energy and you want to make batteries or solar panels or, I don't know, electric cars. And at this time, China is the world's leader in solar and green energy, electric cars too. And so you are afraid that if you allow Chinese solar panels into the United States or Chinese electric vehicles into the United States, they will have this first mover advantage. And your own manufacturers will never catch up and will never be able to compete with the Chinese manufacturers. And so in that case, it may be wise for a short period of time to limit imports so that your own capability can be developed during that time, so that you can then compete on equals. Again, simply imposing the import tariffs, by the way, would not be enough. So it would have to be a holistic program designed to develop that specific industry. South Koreans, by the way, did it extremely well. Taiwan to some extent too. But when you read the book called How Asia Works, they discuss it. So it would have to be not only the ban on foreign products to limit the competition for those few years when you're developing your own capabilities, but also relentless government work towards trying to develop export capabilities for those products, because local demand often is not enough, providing all the necessary supplies, buying the technologies, buying the licenses for the technologies. So simply banning the products probably will just lead to higher prices or no product available at all. But if you do it well in the whole complex, it may actually give the necessary boost and foundation to develop your own technology, and it might actually work well, at least has worked in some cases. Again, as a short-term solution to support so-called infant industries until they grow and until they can compete on their own. Likewise, maybe support industries going through restructuring. So in 2008, when Chrysler and GM filed for bankruptcy, as you know, there were no import tariffs on Japanese or Korean cars per se, but the government seems to have been doing everything possible to sort of try to limit imports of those cars. It was at that time that Toyota had this incident where the car presumably wouldn't brake. So you push the brake, but instead it accelerates. Sudden acceleration, something fault. And later on, it was actually proven, or at least enough evidence emerged, that there was nothing wrong with the Toyota and Lexus cars. But the government jumped on the story, on the situation, and Toyota, got some serious beating. So they did everything possible to sort of make Japanese cars less attractive in hope that American cars will become more attractive. And it did kind of work to some extent. And so for a while, they were trying to limit foreign automobiles in the United States, and by doing so help American companies going through the tough times to get back on their feet and then compete. And that actually worked. So the bailout packages, the loans to Chrysler and GM actually allowed them to get back on track, and they seem to be doing pretty well now. So it seems like that helped a little bit at least. So let me share the slides. Now, the problem is that, and going back to today's time, so as you know, we have a developing story, the trade war between China and the United States. And Donald Trump, as he promised, and I'll show you a video from many years ago where he was saying that he would do what he's doing now. So he imposed import tariffs. In fact, let me show you this video now. Let's see if it's still going to work. So that's from like 5 years ago. So when he was running for president, I think it was even the first time, not the second time. So if the video is removed, I have a copy, but I think it should work. Doesn't seem to be loading. Okay, let's see if it works. Oh, come on. So in this video, I probably should have prepared a little bit better.
Top story tonight, Donald Trump for president, looks like he might run. New Harris Internet poll out today says 10% of Americans would vote for Mr. Trump, and that ties him with Mitt Romney in the lead for the Republican sweepstakes. But is Donald Trump really up to the job? Here we go. All right, let's start with the big issue in the 2012 presidential race, jobs. Why haven't jobs come back as fast as many people thought they should?
Because they're going to China. China is taking our jobs, they're making our product, and we have to do something about it, and we have to do something about it quickly. They are decimating our country just as OPEC is decimating our country with their oil prices.
But how can you compete with Chinese labor, which is much, much less than unionized American labor? I mean, what are you going to make a law that says you can't, American companies can't manufacture in China? You're going to make a law?
By getting China not to manipulate their currency. It's very tough for our companies to compete with Chinese companies because very simply they manipulate their currency. And when you manipulate a currency like they do, they're professionals at it.
Well, how are you going to do that, though? Chinese are going to say, we're going to do what we want.
They're going
We don't
to do
care what
something
you say.
very simple, Bill. 25% tax on China unless they behave.
25% on China unless they behave. Interesting, again, I hope you did notice that the video...
Two things, really, and really three.
I hope you noticed that the video is from 2011. So it's not even the 2016 election. That's the election where Mitt Romney was campaigning, competing with Obama. So Trump was not nominated at that time. But what's interesting, and you got to give it to him. So at that time, so it's almost a decade ago, he was talking about imposing import tariffs on China. Now that he's become a president, he's done it. And so we're yet to see the economic effects of that. So, but the question then becomes, well, would import tariffs then be a good policy? And so again, some people don't like it. Some people don't like Trump and don't like anything he does. Other people like it, or maybe they like Trump and believe anything he does is good. But the truth is that import tariffs it's a two-edged sword. So they can have some positives and they can have some negatives. Negatives, I mean, all economic theory says that import tariffs are technically bad. If you believe in free market economy and the economic theory says that free market is good, it means that you let the consumers choose and decide. And so from Adam Smith's invisible hand, Wealth of Nations, trade has been proven again and again and again that trade is good. So trade is good, and I hope nobody would say that trade is bad. And import tariffs impede trade. So they, by that, they become bad. But maybe sometimes it's actually justifiable to use import tariffs. As we said, maybe when you have industry protection, maybe when your own specific industry is going through some restructuring, or maybe if the other partner is cheating. Again, allegedly. China has been stealing the US technology. Allegedly, China has been unjustifiably, unfairly manipulating its currency. And by doing so, it tilted the playing field in its favor. And some of that may be even true. So we know that, for example, companies that do business in China, that the laws are such, at least in some sectors, that you must have a Chinese partner, you must reveal and share your technology with the Chinese partner, and in many cases, the Chinese partner must have the controlling stake. And so if that's true, it's not fair. It does create the situation where Chinese companies are advantaged. And if you believe that that's really what's happening, because again, nobody really seems to have full information. But if we believe those allegations, and if you tried to talk to them and they wouldn't do anything about it, and if the only way to exert pressure on them is to impose import tariffs, it may be a viable policy. May be a viable policy. But, and there are some big buts here. One, not clear if those allegations are true. For example, currency manipulation, we have a whole lecture on international financial markets. It's not such a simple issue. Like by currency manipulation, what usually Trump means is that China keeps its currency artificially low. But to keep the currency artificially cheap, low, exchange rate low, first of all, it costs a lot of money. Second, it has very strong economic effects. If it was so easy, America would do the same thing. But I mean, obviously, it has its own costs. China chose to take those costs, but it's not necessarily wrong or illegal. So, and in a sense, China imposes a tax on its own citizens by reducing the value of the currency, and thereby sort of almost forces Chinese workers to sell the products cheaper, so kind of extracts some money from its workers. So it's not so simple. What bothers me here is, for example, NAFTA, right? So, and again, I'm not saying what's wrong, what's right, I'm just giving you some facts here. So we've had NAFTA since 1994, signed by Bill Clinton. Trump said that he doesn't like NAFTA and he would repeal and replace NAFTA. There was a lot of talks going on in 2018. Canada, Mexico, the United States met and spent a lot of time negotiating. They presumably repealed NAFTA and imposed something new in its place, new NAFTA, right? Many people believe that it's good. Many people believe that it's bad. But the fact is that almost nobody knows what exactly happened. Even I tried to do some research. I still have no clue what exactly was wrong with NAFTA, what exactly is different in the new agreement, and how exactly it changes the situation. So people are celebrating, those who support Trump are celebrating the New Deal. People who don't like Trump are not happy because they're not happy about anything that Trump does. But the truth is, if I ask you, do you know what changed in NAFTA? Do you know what was bad there and what's better now? How did it change for the United States? I bet that you will have no clue what exactly changed. And that's what bothers me. So we fight about things like we say, oh, China is cheating, Canada is cheating, Mexico is cheating, but we don't really know, like, so what exactly do they do? Like, what specifically we don't like about that? Do they have import tariffs on our goods? Well, we know they don't. I mean, it's a free, China is a member of WTO, Mexico, Canada, free trade zone. So what exactly was wrong then? And what exactly was fixed? And so maybe there was something wrong. Maybe there was an initial agreement in place that would favor those other countries. Although, again, having lived in Canada for many years, they believe that the agreement is in favor of Mexico and the United States against Canada. And I've been to Mexico multiple times, and I know many of them hate NAFTA. They believe that America and Canada, being richer and more economically powerful, take advantage of Mexico. So each of the three countries believe that the other two are taking advantage of them, which mathematically is impossible, mutually exclusive. So what exactly was wrong? As I said, maybe something was wrong, but people don't really know, and yet they still passionately, advocate the issues. So I don't know. Maybe those allegations against China are not even true. If true, and if that's the only way to do it, maybe then import tariffs and trade war would be justified. But again, keep in mind that one, they will already have retaliate with their own tariffs. And so just like it is now more difficult for Chinese producers to sell products in the United States, so it is more difficult for American companies to sell their products in China. Notably, for example, farmers are hurting. So China imposed import tariffs on American goods, including agriculture, and all of a sudden they're losing a lot of money here, the farmers. And so is it worth the losses? I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. It's important just to take that into account and do your calculations. If you think that that pressure will eventually lead to the good outcome, maybe it's worth taking the risk and paying the price. Second, it's very important to remember that import tariffs, that's a tax on your own consumers. So it's not a tariff on the Chinese companies. The Chinese companies don't pay it. Your consumers pay it. So what happens is that every time a product is sold in the United States, or every time it enters the United States, the tax on it must be paid, which is added automatically, essentially, to the price. Maybe the producers will absorb part of it, but most of it will be simply added to the price. And so what happens every time you buy a Chinese product like this charger, you, the consumer, pay more. So it's a tax on you, the American consumer. Again, is it bad? No, not necessarily. So again, if the situation is unfair, if your trading partner is cheating or doing something wrong, if you ask nicely and they didn't behave, comply, maybe the only way to do it is to start this war in which you may lose, but you believe that if you win, it will be worth it. But as I said, it's always very important to keep that cost in your mind, because in many cases, people jump on the bandwagon, jump on this policy without realizing the huge costs and risks it entails. If the analysis shows that it's worth it, maybe it's worth it. But you have to think about all possible aspects. Many people believe that import tariffs would save jobs and bring jobs back. And that's true that, to some extent it does work for some industries. The latest story was the import tariffs on all kinds of Chinese goods, and not only Chinese, by the way. So lately we had also disputes with the European Union, Canada, Mexico. And so before that, by the way, we had the same thing. So we had import tariffs on steel in the 90s imposed by Bill Clinton. We had the import tariffs imposed on Chinese, for example, tires imposed by Obama. And presumably that did save jobs in industries that make steel, tires, and so on and so forth. What's tricky here is that every time you impose a tariff on a product, it benefits that very small interest group, manufacturers of tires, steel, or one of the recent examples, washing machines. And yes, for them, it's good. For them, it means that they will be able now to sell more of their own products, because the foreign-made products are more expensive because a tax is added to that product. Import tariff is added to that product. But the important thing is that we all are paying for that. So because a tax is added to the price, we as consumers pay for those prices. And so you can easily calculate how much that policy costs. You impose an import tariff worth, let's say, $20 billion, as it happened recently. For example, with the washing machines, it was $1.5 billion. With the agricultural goods, it was up to $20 billion. And then you see how many jobs are saved. So let's say you impose import tariffs on Chinese washing machines. A total of $1.5 billion have been paid over the year by American consumers for now more expensive washing machines. Then you see how many more workers are working in that industry. And so when they did the calculations for the washing machines, they found that each job saved for that industry cost $115,000 in the extra money that the U.S. consumers paid. So we are talking about here about a job that costs almost $1 million, and I've seen the same calculations for just about every previous trade war or import tariff dispute. And yes, usually you would be looking at about $100,000 to up to $1 million that each of those jobs cost per year to American consumers. So it's literally cheaper to pay them and retrain them than to save the jobs that way. Because as I said, it looks like you're saving a specific segment, but you have to realize that everybody is paying for that. And that everybody could have been spending this money on this money on something else. And as a result, creating demand and jobs in other sectors. So what's right, what's wrong? Not for me to say. I'm just saying that you need to take all parts of the equation into account. And after you've done it, if you think it's still worth it, I still want to save those jobs at $815,000 a year. Good for you. You have the policy at your disposal. You can do it. It's just important that you do those calculations, because it's a two-sided sword, and sometimes the other side is much sharper than the one that you're thinking about. So it's also very important to think about. Well, you know what? Let's stop here. Actually, no, let's talk about one thing here. So it's very important to think about countries in international trade context as people, and think about it not so much as buying and selling and creating jobs, but as trade, because the trade, it's exchange, right? And so a very good way to think about it is to think about it as John Smith as a representation of the United States. So imagine that you have a person, his name is John Smith. He is a freelance computer programmer. He's underemployed. He wants to work, 25 hours a week, but he wants to work 40 hours a week, but he now works since 2010. He works only about 25 hours a week. So he's underemployed. He would like to have a steady full-time jobs. He has a previous experience as a full-time factory worker, but then his job got outsourced, and so he lost his job. And so now he's trying to do a little job as a programmer, but he's not very good at programming. And so as a result, he has only some contracts, and he's underemployed. And his aspiration is a great high-tech job. Now, it's similar to America. So America is a nice nation of educated people, great nation of educated people, but it's underemployed. So it has, unemployment is kind of low now, but when you look at the labor force participation rate, as you see, so that's the percentage of people eligible to work who actually work. And as you can see, this number is around 62% now. So it's been 67%, and then has been steadily dropping and going down. And by the way, those who would like to blame it, for example, on Obama, under Obama, it accelerated following the crisis. But then, for example, at some point, it seems like the crisis stopped. And so Obama was assumed office around here, right at the end of 2016, more like here, right? And so it seems like at some point it stabilized and has been relatively stable under Trump. So it seems like it's a trend, economic trend, and individual presidents didn't have a huge impact on it, right? In any case, many Americans are not working, most by choice. Some cannot find a job. America used to be a leader in manufacturing, and most of the jobs relocated to Asia and Latin America. And America is now only 62% employed. And its aspiration is to become a world leader in new age sector, whatever that means. So the question is, what kind of advice would you give to John in his situation to get better? Think about it for a second, and what would you tell John to do to get back on his feet and do better? When I ask this question of my students, they always say, John, you probably should go back to school. You probably should retrain. You probably should gain new skills and experiences, and hopefully as a result you will be more employable as a programmer, and you will have a better job, better income, better life. What many people recommend America in this situation to do is to impose tariffs. So many people would say, America, you know what? Your problem is that your jobs are going to China. And to deal with that, you have to ban Chinese imports. And that will allow you to do those products, make those products in the United States. It will increase your income level and you will be richer. If we were to give that same advice to John, we would be saying something like this. We would say, John, all your problems are not because you are not qualified or trained enough. It's because you outsource too much of your own work to others. Like, for example, John, who made your short? Oh, it was made by a tailor. See, if you did it, you would have had that job, but you outsourced it, so tailor made the money and you lost the money. John, who repaired your car? Or a mechanic. See, you outsourced the job, you should have done it yourself. John, who baked your bread? Oh, it was the baker. See, you outsourced your job and you're now underemployed. You know, John, what you should do is you should stop buying products from other people. In fact, to help you, we will tax you each time you buy a product from someone else. You want to buy a shirt from a tailor, we will double the price. We will impose a 100% tariff or 25% tariff. You want to buy bread from a baker, we will impose a tariff on that bread. We will make it difficult, expensive for you to buy bread and shoes and clothing and everything from others. That will help you. If you do it, obviously it would be absurd. Yes, John will have to work all day, all night, but he probably will still not be better off. He will be baking his own bread and making his own shirts, repairing his car, painting his house. He will be more employed when you look at the number of hours he will have to work. But will he be better off? Obviously not. I mean, international trade or trade in general, that's what makes us more wealthy. Specialization. Adam Smith, read The Wealth of Nations. It explains, how trade, how exchange of goods makes us all better off. And we had a whole separate lecture on that. So by forcing John to make all products in-house, obviously you will make him worse off, even though he will be more employed. Same thing with the United States. So maybe the way to deal with this problem is not to impose restrictions on foreign-made products, but maybe to invest more in development of your own capabilities, making business easier to do. And again, looking at Trump's policies, we can like his tax reform or not like it, but one thing I like very much about it is that it lowered the corporate income tax. Again, the question is where the money will come to replace it. But at the very least, it means that the businesses now are paying less in taxes, at least as far as the corporate income tax. Maybe we should pour more money into training and education, especially if we believe that some industries will be important tomorrow. Maybe we should make it easier for students to attain those degrees and skills. So retraining, becoming more competitive seems to be the way to go, instead of pretending that those other countries don't exist, building a wall and trying to compete that way. And yes, sometimes you just cannot outsource your homework to India, because you have to learn yourself. Outsourcing may be cheaper, but I would not allow my children to outsource. Although, sometimes I think maybe I should. Do I want my kid to become a good factory worker, or do I want my kid to become a good entrepreneur? And if he can find ways to do his homework through India, and if in the process he will not learn how to do math, but he will learn how to do business, I don't know. I wouldn't like it today, but maybe that's wrong. Maybe he should be more like Nike, who make shoes overseas and sell them here and make millions of dollars in the process. I don't know. And I'll just conclude with this picture. I took this picture in my gym, so that's from the gym that I was in. Now it's a different one, but it doesn't matter. It's a dumbbell, very crude work. As you see, it's as low, I guess quality in this case, as it gets. And it's a product with a very low value density. I mean, it's a piece of metal that you sell for pennies, and, and it was made in China. And it's probably a fully automated process anyway. So sometimes some of the job outsourcing just boggles me. I mean, couldn't you make it here, given how expensive it is to transport it? So anyway, just something to think about. All right, I'll stop here, and I hope you learned something new. Again, I hope I did not offend anyone, and I apologize if I did, but I just wanted to give you a full picture. Thank you very much.